Hi, good morning. So our team was responsible for the literature review portion of this project. So we had the same sort of charting method that Christine had applied to in terms of looking at the clinical findings. We actually ended up consolidating or omitting some of the clinical findings because they weren't reported as robustly in the literature consistently compared to the natural history study. But the method was the same. We had to extract our data from published literature on patients with Zellweger spectrum disorder. So this is just giving you an overview of our methods, and basically our inclusion criteria for our literature review were studies that describe patients that had ZSD, and there was a description of clinical findings in the studies, and then also looking at papers that actually there was some sort of semblance of a designation of severity in these papers. There were some studies that didn't have a clear designation of severity, and in those cases, if there were enough clinical findings that were included in that study, then we applied the same severity flowchart criteria that Christine had described that she had used for the natural history study. What we also did is that we took that severity flowchart and sort of tried to see if they aligned with some of the author's designations of severities in the papers, and we actually found that in most of the papers, that flowchart criteria aligned very, very well with these multiple papers where there were these designations of severity assigned. So we put in our relevant search terms in our databases, and for a rare disease, when you put in these search terms, you actually get a lot of papers. So we ended up with somewhere a little over 450 hits, and then as we slowly whittled down to make sure that these papers did include clinical findings, did have a way that we could designate severity, we ended up with about 107 papers that were included in this literature review, and 22 of them were what we call cohort studies, meaning that in the patient population that was studied, there was an N of 3 or more. And then we had about 85 case studies where they evaluated the clinical findings in 1 or 2 patients with ZSD. So that was a little bit about our methods for our literature review. So this is the table that describes the prevalence of clinical findings across severity levels in the cohort studies. So again, we had about 22 individual studies that were included in this. Up top, you'll see the designation of severe, intermediate, mild, and that doesn't add up to 22, but that's because we had some studies that had mixed severities in the patient population. And the way that I organized this is very similar to how Christine organized her tables, except in these cohort studies, I included how many specific studies specifically included that particular clinical finding, and then reported on how many patients within all of those studies had that particular clinical finding out of all of the studies that included that clinical finding. That made sense, right? What we see is that, and then again, the same sort of asterisk and application applies, where with the asterisk, it shows a significant difference in prevalence of this particular clinical finding between severe and intermediate, where the caret represents significant differences between the mild and the intermediate. And we saw a lot of similarities with the natural history study across seizures. One thing that we found that was significantly different that wasn't necessarily reported in the natural history study is that we saw significant differences in the reporting of brain abnormalities. And when I say brain abnormalities, we're talking about abnormalities that were detected by MRI, which was the same way that it was detected in the natural history study, but we also included brain abnormalities that were evaluated at autopsy in some of these studies as well. So we saw differences across seizures, brain abnormalities, low tone, feeding difficulties. Again, I mentioned that some of these clinical findings are consolidated or omitted altogether compared to the natural history study because we just didn't have enough studies that reported on these particular clinical findings in the literature. but we also saw differences in vision, hearing loss, the presence of renal cysts, and similar to the natural history study, which one is there we go. We also saw an increased prevalence of adrenal insufficiency in the patients that were classified as intermediate compared to the severe. When we looked at the case studies, and again, there were 85 case studies that were included, we saw trends that were similar to what we saw in the cohort studies and in the natural history study. However, the majority of the data that we got did not reach statistical significance. The only place where we saw statistical significance was looking at different, let's go back. Was looking at renal cysts where there was a significant difference between the severe patients and the intermediate patients. So now we've got 3 data sets, right? So we've got the natural history study data set, we've got these cohort studies, and we've got these case studies. So we looked at survival data, and there was a lot of reports on survival in the literature, and we asked our statistician to generate Kaplan-Meier survival curves for each of these individual data sets. And so A is the cohort studies in the literature, B is the case studies in the literature, and C is the natural history study. And again, the same colors apply where severe is the red, intermediate is the blue, and green is the mild. And we saw very distinct, as you would expect, very distinct survival patterns across these different categories, and they were all statistically significant. So we see, it's nice to sort of see these sort of similar trends across all of these data sets. So that was basically the gist of my role in this paper. So I'm going to invite Christine to come up here and sort of summarize the overall findings. I think that's it, right? Yes.
Thank you. Yes, so just to make maybe a summary of the findings from the 3 data sets, just talking about the prevalence at the moment. So here this is showing the difference in prevalence between the severe groups and the intermediate groups with all our data combined together. So there were differences in seizure abnormal, EEG, brain abnormalities, vision loss, hearing loss, bilateral, renal critical microcysts, cardiac abnormalities, and survival. And some of them were only seen in the literature, some of them were only seen in the natural history study, and so that's linked a little bit with the limitation with the type of data we were working with. And as we mentioned as well, the only symptom that we saw more prevalent in the intermediate versus severe was the adrenal insufficiency, and of course, what we think is happening here is that, well, I'm sorry, I have trouble. I thought we were going to talk about limitations, so I'm going to. Are you going to talk about it? Okay. Sorry about this. And so, because of course the severe babies often don't survive past 2 years of age, and maybe we would expect these severe patients to develop adrenal insufficiency, it's just that they don't have time to develop it. So that's why we think it is probably happening more frequently in the intermediate group. And then in terms of looking at the difference between intermediate and mild patients, that we see more prevalence of all of these symptoms in the intermediate group compared to the mild one. I will not go through them all individually. And the only things that we saw more prevalent in the mild versus intermediate, it's in terms of developmental outcomes like walking independently or putting 2 fingers together or doing full sentences. And I wanted to remind you that the only symptoms that were that we had enough data on and that were statistically significant enough to be able to run our prediction model were these scores: the seizure, the EEG, the renal cyst, and the cardiac abnormalities. And I think I mentioned that already, but I think I just wanted to point out that the purpose of this work was really to do some groundwork, to have something somewhere to start, and we hope to be able to ameliorate this kind of work, of course, and have the ability to do a more precise and a better characterization of severity in the future. And the reason why we think it's important is that this will help for choosing the right patients for clinical trials and also manage expectation when there will be a different clinical trial, so we'll know if the patient fits more in which severity. So with that, I will let Mousumi talk about the limitations, and I'll get back after her.
Just keeping people on their toes. So the other thing that I'll just sort of use as kind of segue into kind of like the understanding of the limitations is that, you know, all of the attempts, and so we actually tried to do modeling with the literature review data as well, and it was just so all over the place that there was just no way to see any sort of consistent kind of trends or, you know, make some sort of prediction of severity. So again, this sort of speaks to this need for this kind of, and that's going to be the sort of overall point that I think we're trying to make here, is that there's this need for more data collection, more standardized data collection, and more centralized data collection, so that we can apply the sort of same parameters in terms of trying to figure out whether or not, you know, we have enough information to create some of these models in better ways. You know, this is meant to be a starting point, but, you know, there's still obviously a lot of work that needs to be done. So I'll just quickly describe the limitations and what, going back to my other point about, you know, not necessarily having data that was robust enough to create these sort of models in the literature. The fact that we have these sort of different kind of rules, although we try to apply very similar criteria to everything, it just, you know, we couldn't necessarily say with confidence that, you know, these reports were all consistent in terms of how they actually collected this data. And so that allows for, so sort of makes it for, you know, again, this idea of like, this is meant to be a starting point, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Our severity designation criteria, you know, one of the sort of, what's the word, motivations in doing a study like this was really to say, well, you know, if you look in the literature, it seems like, you know, severity designation is relatively arbitrary at this point. You know, based on some consensus criteria, but nothing like sort of standardized across the board. And then we came in and said, well, we're going to come in with our own designation criteria and apply this. So that in itself is kind of a limitation. But you know, this designation criteria that Christine came up was based on, you know, this natural history study, which is at this point the most largest collection of data that we have on patients with ZSD. And the fact that we were able to use this criteria and apply it to what we saw in the literature and see good alignment gives us, you know, at least some confidence that, you know, this criteria, again, is a good starting point, but needs to be sort of fleshed out as we learn more. And again, I mentioned that, you know, these, Christine and I both mentioned about the, you know, only including a few, able to include a few of these clinical findings in the modeling analysis. Again, sort of this call to action to, you know, make efforts to create more standardized, consistent, more centralized data on patients moving forward. And then one thing, when we were getting the reviews for the peer reviews for this paper, one thing that was mentioned that, you know, I think is a really important point is that although we reported age, and I know that Christine had reported age onset, we didn't really include that into our analysis of how age affects severity with respect to these clinical findings. And the reason that we didn't do that is because we just, it was hard enough to get statistical significance with just the overall collection of data, and we started to stratify by age. We were afraid that we were going to lose any significance that we did see. So again, there's a need for more data in order to really understand. And we know that there is an impact. We know that there is data published that shows that age can affect, at the very least, biochemical markers. So there is definitely a need to sort of understand the role of age in determining severity and you know, other clinical findings. So I'm going to pass it back to Christine, and I'll see you guys back up here in a minute. Thank you.
So I just wanted to get back to, so now we talked about the specific project. I just wanted to do a brief conclusion about the natural history study in general, in which we're doing multiple different projects. And so, as we mentioned, we hope that we got this point across that this review of clinical findings and severity was really a base foundation work, and we want to work more on it. And hopefully what we would like to do in the future is to be able to develop a method to establish a severity score in for spectrum disorder. So that would be a type of score that would describe severity in an individual that could change over time, or that could change with an intervention. And the idea would be to see if a treatment or an intervention could ameliorate the overall clinical picture in a patient. And so we have been working on this already. Last summer, we had this student with us, Mary Gopian, at McGill University. She did a summer research project with us in which she developed a machine learning method to be able to look at the data from the natural history study and see if the data naturally separated in different categories. And so I will not go into the detail of her methodology flowchart, but I want to say that she did a pilot study starting with only ophthalmology findings to start with, and she looked at all the data from our natural history study. She did some fancy things to clean the data up and let the data speak to us, basically, to be able to remove the bias that we have in our grades and let the machine tell us how the data separates, basically. And so she was able to find that the ophthalmology data that she looked at most clustered or separated the most efficiently in two groups. And this is just a representation of the two clusters. And so that was the result of her summer work. And the idea would be for us to look whether there are correlations between the different two groups with genotypes, with biochemical markers, or with even clinical findings from other organ systems, and see how this can work together. And so the idea is to be able at some point to come up with a multi-system severity scoring system for ZSD. And I also wanted to mention that as we are working right now doing a retrospective review of all the ophthalmic findings in ZSD, so that's we're preparing this manuscript, we're getting ready to prepare this prospective study on vision loss in ZSD. And what we want to do with this prospective study, we would like it to be multi-centered, and we would like to do eye and vision evaluations every year for 5 years in the same cohort of patients. To be able to really get more robust data than what we have at the moment. And the purpose is to come up with good clinical endpoints and identify therapeutic windows and inclusion criteria for future clinical trials on vision. And as you will hear in the conference in the next few days, there are some very exciting preclinical studies on retinal gene therapy, for example. So our hope would be to have this prospective study done before we can do the clinical trials on humans. And I would like to take a moment to thank everybody in my lab, the collaborators for the project that I presented. Of course, I would like to give a big thank you to all the families who participated in the study and agreed to share the medical records of themselves or their child, the funding agency, and we have a website. You can come and visit it. So thank you so much.
We do have a few minutes for questions for Christine or Mousumi.
Thanks. Really great work. So I'm just trying to understand, something like seizures. An infant that is having seizures, or during the first year, there's many different ways that infant is going to be classified as severe. So then comparing severe to intermediate seems like tautological to me. Like to say 100% of the severe patients have seizures, but the reason that they're severe is, we recognize them as severe because of that feature.
Yes.
So is there a way to use orthogonal methods to define groups like genotypes that would be, and then sort of use these categories more as recognizable clinical patterns that because if we're going to go to like using this as the method part, to me, I feel like we should incorporate genotypes at that point.
Yes, thank you for the comments. I totally agree. The reason we started by looking only at clinical findings is that because when we started, I mean, we thought about that for a long time, and of course we want to find genotype-phenotype correlations, but we found that it was not, there was too many exceptions to start with, so we had a lot of patients with, non-functional alleles that looked more like intermediate pictures or vice versa, and so it was really difficult, so we wanted to be able to come up with something that could distinguish severity, so we thought, why not try to look at just the clinical findings and not think about genotype for a moment and see how that works. So that was the reasoning, but I agree with your first comment, that was the fact that, of course, it's like a loop because we're including these criteria to determine severity, and then, of course, it's going to separate, by the same way. The reason why we still did it is because we thought at the time that we could not do it better. Like, we know that's a big limitation, but it was what we had to work with initially. So I think it is important to know this limitation and take this with a grain of salt a little bit. However, I think it is still interesting, though, if we take the example of seizures, the fact that, yes, we took, well, first of all, for the severity designation, it's not seizure alone. So if the patient only had seizure, of course, it would not be a severe patient. So you had to have at least 4 of them, which makes it a bit stronger, I think. But it was interesting to see that after that, a patient with an intermediate overall disease severity could still have seizure, but you saw that the prevalence was just something like 50 or 60%, while the severe was 100 and mild was. So I think that in that sense, it still taught us something, but definitely if we would want something that's foolproof and really strong, we would need to start with no apprehension and let the data tell us what it tells us, but we couldn't do that at the moment.
I have an additional question, Christine. I also think it's a very valuable set of data and absolutely also for future research. But similar as Mike, I have a bit of the same question about the severity designation, because it struck me that not only seizure, but actually all the parameters that were statistically significant were already part of the severity designation. So I also think that's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because that mainly tells you that you did the original division in severity correctly, but doesn't say much about severity of the patients or the correlation, I think.
Yes, I agree, but I just want to add there that at least what it told us also is that it reinforced our original designation. Well,
but that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it only tells you that you did the first step correctly.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just what you just said funky.
But maybe that's not a bad thing. I think it still tells you a lot, also just about the data, but I don't think you can do like a multi-nominal logistic model then on it, because that's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It will predict if it was already part of your first designation criteria.
Right. But the C2060 levels, though, were not part of the original criteria.
No,
which
so
we're excited about.
That's what I was also what striking me. So I think it also tells something that a lot of those other parameters, like biochemical parameters, were not robust enough, only the viral chain fatty acids. So maybe that also tells actually that we that it's difficult at least to predict severity based on our traditional biochemical parameters. So we probably have new parameters. That was why I also really like the last approach, because then you're really forced to let go our own thoughts about severity, because I think we have to let go our own ideas and thoughts about severity, because maybe we're completely wrong on that, actually. Right?
Thank you for your question.
Just follow this into questions that is relevant. So after Mike talk, I thought even you didn't start with the genotype,
But if you now have all the genotype information, you can go back, see how fit in, right? So then we can go back and look at this. So that's one thing. Another thing to remind me when you talk to C26, I think, Anne, I want to ask you, if I remember or understand correctly, in the XLD, I don't think the C26 LPC, the level is correlating to the severity. I don't know how to apply here. Well, an XLD doesn't correlate. But more or less it correlates in the accelerated spectrum.
Yeah, I think we knew already that more or less it did correlate in ZSD, and now we're just kind of showing it. But yes, I totally agree with the first comment. It is, I forgot to mention, but it is in our future work regarding this project, because at least for the natural history study, yes, we do have mutations on almost all the patients. So it will be easy and interesting to get back and see them, how that fits in the, yes.
Any final questions? Oh, right.
Thank you. Just one or two quick questions. So first is regarding this definition problem. Didn't you want to make a simple clustering method, which is out of your personal decisions, but probably perhaps statistically? And the second one is that you have data, not just cross-sectional, but you have data in time. And I think this time horizon really helps because your outcome variable is not really stable in the sense that probably it can change in time from mild to severe, especially. This is my experience. I have only one experience, but what I have seen is that based on your definition, probably one patient is mild at the age of 4 and will become severe or at least intermediate. So probably using time horizon and some panel estimation, not cross-sectional, may help.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this comment. Yes, you're right. So what we did is that we took longitudinal data and we marked clinical finding as present at any age retrospectively. So of course, it's not meant to be able to evaluate one patient at one time, at 4 years old, and see if the patient is severe, mild, intermediate. It's a way to look at the whole history of the patient and see how he fits. So in that sense, we do not expect this designation to change with time. But yes, in the future, what we want to do is that we have started to use kind of clustering methods and machine learning method to be able to do that kind of work and take into account age and have a kind of a severity scoring that could change with time. And this, maybe that will not take the designation of mild, intermediate, and severe. Maybe that would be something that's more gradual. So we don't really know at the moment. I think Dr. Riverman wants to add something, so I'll pass the mic.
Thank you, Billy, for all of these comments. But just what we're all sort of reiterating is that this is complicated. Like there's such variation in this disorder. It's difficult to get a grasp on categorizing the children in their degree of severity. But the reason it's important is not only the families and the prognosis, but it's important when you do a clinical trial to put together children that are somewhat similar. And that's one of the goals here. How do we put together children that are somewhat similar when we have so much difficulty finding those similarities to group them? So these are really, really important issues. We are beginning to tackle it, but really any suggestions that people have would be useful. All these suggestions are great.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Christine. Okay, give her. I just want to remind people as well, we're going to be, after Mousumi's presentation, it looks like we're running ahead of schedule, which gives everybody about a 30-minute break. and then we will get back together for lunch. There will be some time to discuss at your tables, but one of the things we encourage you to do over the next day or two is exactly what Nancy was talking about, is coming up with these questions, these ideas for the future, because as we know, there are just a lot of complicating factors. So just be sure to know that also this afternoon we're going to have some very specific discussion about 2 grants that we've been working on. And I think a lot of this information is also going to be very pertinent as we have those discussions this afternoon. So at this time, I want to introduce our dear friend Mousumi Bose again from Montclair State University. She's going to present her findings from her nutritional studies. So thank you, Mousumi.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to stand up here because I have a lot of stuff that I want to share, but within the time frame. So I have notes up here that I'm just sort of keeping. So if I come over here, what was I supposed to say? You know why. Some of you know who I am, and obviously you've met me, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about myself. One thing I do want to just say is that I got into this field because I had a son who had a very severe form of ZSD, and I was a researcher prior to that. I got my degree in nutrition, and I quit my job to take care of him and really thought I wasn't going to do research again. And then I met members of the GFPD, and then I started doing research again. But now it's a little bit different from what I was doing before. So a lot of times when I'm up here talking about some of the things that I'm doing, they tend to be a little different from all of the other really amazing research that's going out there, because a lot of my research is really kind of influenced by my own personal experience and my conversations with other families and things that are important to me as the parent of a child with this disease. And that was really the sort of impetus for this study, because I have a background in nutrition, and when I was on the Facebook support group for parents, a lot of the conversation really surrounded what to feed your children. And when the sort of seeds of this idea of like, okay, how do we best know what dietary recommendations to make for our kids? I thought about these conversations we had in the Facebook support group, and then and did a little sort of digging on my own in terms of looking at the impact of nutrition on, and I'm going back and forth with, I'm sorry the terminology here, but when I say PBD, obviously I'm talking about ZSD in particular. And once we did a little bit of research here and sort of took into account the conversations that we had with families, is that despite the fact that we know that, ZSD can affect growth and other parameters of nutritional status, a lot of times individuals with ZSD are, they get a G-tube or some sort of feeding assistance to help with their feeding. A lot of families that I found in our Facebook group have been given advice on how to best provide nutrition for their child, but there's been a lot of back and forth. And overall, sort of what I really gathered in this research is that there's no professional or community consensus on how to best feed our children. That sort of informed like what my ultimate research questions for the study was. We know that there is discussion, and there have been some limited studies on phytanic acid restriction, and I certainly know that this is discussed a lot among the families. There has been some studies looking at DHA supplementation, which is a fatty acid, and again, in both cases, the published literature is limited and it's conflicting. So we don't really know if either of these things are actually very useful in sort of improving the quality of life for patients with CSD and related peroxisomal disorders. But really, what's more than that is, despite the fact that we know that nutrition plays a big part in CSD, there's not even any research out there on what our kids are eating and how many calories they're consuming. How does that affect growth? We don't know what their sort of energy intake is. We don't know, what their sort of macronutrient breakdown is. We don't know what micronutrients they're getting, if they're deficient in any of these things sort of consistently. So that was something that also I was interested in learning. And I know that we have a lot of families that have G-tubes, and there is some data, not necessarily in ZSD, but in other circumstances where a G-tube is necessary, that have shown differences across these different feeding modalities in nutrient intake and nutrient status. So that was another sort of question that I had. Well, are there differences in nutrient status between individuals with ZSD that are fed primarily orally versus individuals that are tube fed? And then, and to add more to the questions, this is what I think I'm doing. I was like, well, what do we know? And I kept finding out what we don't know. And what we also don't know is how do we best measure dietary intake in individuals with ZSD, and that there's no studies obviously on looking at dietary intake in ZSD, but there's very few studies out there that have looked at similar sort of patient populations and studied dietary intake. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think part of the reason in looking at sort of just data collection methods in nutrition assessment, they really rely on patient reports. So what did you eat in the last 24 hours? Or give us a food journal. And when you have kids with communication difficulties, it's really hard to get that sort of patient report. What's more is that I don't think there's a lot of information on doing dietary assessments in individuals that are tube fed, because I think the sort of overall assumption is that if you are tube fed, you're probably given a formula, and as long as you know what volume and what rates they're being fed, you can get an idea of how much they're eating. But that's just not the case in a lot of our families. A lot of our tube-fed families are getting, oral food supplemented, and then there's this new sort of movement towards home blending for a lot of tube-fed kids, where they're really just eschewing formula, or at least limiting the amount of formula they get, and really using either real food, commercially available real food blends, or they're actually blending at home. So that's something that needs to be taken into consideration when we're trying to determine what nutrient status is in our kids. So there have been some studies that have looked at, in other peroxisomal disorders, and I'm focusing primarily on adult restless disease, where dietary intervention has been shown to improve symptoms. So we don't know really consistently if that's the case in ZSD. I mentioned before there have been studies that have looked at differences in nutrient status across different feeding modalities, like oral and tube-fed patients. So in terms of why does this matter, if we were able to get some insight onto what our kids were eating, that might give us some valuable information in sort of understanding growth trends, which I know is a goal of our natural history study. It may give us insight onto understanding which particular information on how to collect this information, how to collect data on nutrient assessment may be useful if somewhere down the line we want to do a clinical trial that looks at a dietary intervention. If we have these sort of standardized methods of how to collect this data, if we want to do something with titanic acid or with DHA, again, we can apply what we learned from this study. And even if we find a dietary intervention has absolutely no implication in improving symptoms, it's very clear that if we were to find a treatment, some sort of pharmacological treatment, a lot of times there's always risk of nutrient interactions. And so controlling for any sort of confounding variables like nutrition may be useful in as a sort of side thing in clinical trials. So hopefully I've convinced you that it's important to do a study like this, because now I'm going to talk to you about the study that we did. So anyway, so what we did was really ask families to participate in this dietary assessment study. And one thing I didn't mention here, but certainly something that I've recognized in my research, I talked about how dietary assessments are generally self-led. It's based on, subject report. But one thing I've learned in studies with other studies that I've done in ZSD is that parents hold a lot of insight on, the management of their children. So even if the patients themselves can't report on what they're eating, what if we ask the parents, okay, what did your kid eat over the last 24 hours or over the last 3 days? So that's what we did. We looked at dietary assessments using the input of family caregivers. We actually, because we were trying to determine whether or not parents could accurately and consistently report on what their child is eating. So we used 2 sort of standardized, very typical data collection methods, where including a 24-hour recall, and I'll explain what that means in just a second, and also a 3-day food diary where we gave parents basically a sheet and say, please write down what your child has eaten over the last 3 days. And the basic research questions that we wanted to answer here is, well, first, can we do these in a consistent manner using caregiver input, and do parents and caregivers accurately report on their child's intake? Once we determine that, what are they actually eating? What is the nutrition, the nutrient intake of individuals with ZSD? And then the third question that we had is about, are there any differences between tube-fed and orally fed patients with respect to nutrition intake? So that was the basics, like sort of overall objectives of the study. And as I said before, we did 2 different data collection methods to sort of see if this was accurate and consistent over the period of time that we were doing. And we did 2 types of data collection. Like I said, we did a 3-day food record or a 3-day food diary where parents were given this sort of form where they were asked to complete information on what their child ate over the last 3 days. And they were given prior to doing the food diary, they were given an interview on how to actually collect this information. They were also sent out a food scale, as well as a graduated cylinder, so that we could measure how much their child ate over that period of time. They were also given, they were also asked questions about their child's weight and their height, so they were also given like a tape measure as well to measure their child's height. The other data collection thing that we did was a 24-hour recall, where we had a dietitian that basically conducted this recall, basically asking, once they sat down for the interview, okay, it's Monday, we're going to start from Sunday at this time through Monday, tell me everything that your child ate over this 24-hour period. And then we took all this information and we entered it into this nutrition research software called MDSR and got information on how much the sort of absolute values of nutrient intake of what these patients were doing. And so we collected data over a 7-month period. The idea was to actually do the same measurements once a month for 3 months, but with recruiting and with sort of like scheduling these appointments, they tended to sort of get spaced out over time. So we actually ended up collecting all 3 data time points within a 7-month period. We wanted to get 20 people to participate. We only ended up getting 11 to complete the study, which is why we're actually going to be doing another round of this data collection, which I'll talk about briefly at the end. And then our exclusion criteria were children that were breastfed or children that were on IV nutrition. And so this is just a little timeline. Like I said, it was a 7-month data collection period, and then we spent the rest of 2021 really analyzing the data, and then at the beginning of this year starting to get ready for presentation and potential publication. So we had, as I said before, we had 11 patients that were represented in the study by their parents, a variety of age groups, and 7 of them were primarily tube-fed, and 4 of them were primarily orally fed. And there's a lot of stuff here. So the first question was, can caregivers accurately report on their child's nutrient intake? And this, the answer is yes, and I'll show you why. So this first slide that you see here is basically looking at, so each point here is representing a particular nutrient. So it's an average of all nutrients. So like one is like calories, one is carbs, one is fat, and we basically looked at the average of all of these sort of reports throughout the whole 7-month period, and what you see on the y-axis is the intake by food record and the intake of the y-axis is the 24-hour recall, and the x-axis is the food record. And you see very, very strong correlation in terms of the reports that we got for food record and recall. So at the very least, they are reporting this information consistently. And then if you look at, so this may be kind of hard to see, but these are some sample graphs of these different time points of a particular patient. And we're just focusing on energy, and which is calories, and calcium intake. And you'll see that over the 3 time points, they are pretty consistent over that 7-month period in which we were collecting the data. So again, I think we can safely assume that at the very least, caregivers are consistently reporting on their child's intake. So, in terms of understanding what are these individuals with ZSD actually eating, and so the numbers that you see presented here are actually, because we had a lot of age ranges and a lot of these were children who did different growth periods in their lives, so we couldn't look at the absolute nutrient values because they were just not comparable across these age groups and these different sizes. So what we did was, okay, well, how close are these individuals to reaching their recommended dietary allowances or their DRIs? And that's what the number that we present here is the percentage of how close they are to reaching those DRIs. And we see, just for example, in the orally fed group, so these numbers are all percentages. In the orally fed group, the patients were actually quite good at reaching, nearly 100% of what their overall calorie needs are, and that's basically what these numbers are representing. And overall, we see that most of our families, most of our patients are actually pretty good about receiving the nutrients that they need based on what their DRI recommendations are. One exception that we saw, and this was across both oral and tooth-fed, and I should say that when we're looking at kids in general, this is common all across the board. This is just not, exclusive to kids with ZSD, is that nobody's getting enough fiber. What's more is that everybody's getting too much sugar. So that's what we see in kids in general. So, it's nice to know that, our kids are just like every other kid out there. So the other thing that we saw is that because remember our last question was, what are the differences between oral and tooth-fed? And one thing that we saw very consistently across the board, and this is the 24-hour recall data, and you can see this also by the food record data, there is a significant difference in overall sodium intake between oral and tooth-fed kids, with the orally fed kids getting significantly more sodium in their diet than tooth-fed kids. So, and if you take a look at some of these numbers, you can actually see that there may be also some differences here. We also saw almost significant differences in carbohydrate intake, in total fat intake, although it was in the opposite direction where the tooth-fed kids were actually getting more fat than in their diet than the oral-fed kids. And then we also saw potentially some almost significant differences in calcium. And that was really the sort of impetus of doing this second round of the study, which I'll talk about in just a second. So overall, in terms of our research questions, we found that parents can accurately or at least consistently report on their overall dietary intake when you're comparing two different modes and methods of data collection. And that was based on the fact that our diet recall data and our food record data was very, very highly correlated. When we actually separated out, the initial sort of assumption was, well, maybe it's just so highly correlated because we have so many tooth-fed kids in there, and there's a lot more consistency in sort of getting this information from tooth-fed kids. But in fact, our orally fed patients had a stronger correlation when we separated that information out. So I think overall, there's just a very strong sort of consistency, and you can say accurate sort of reporting on food intake by parents. In general, the people that are the patients with PBD-ZSD are meeting their dietary recommendations, and this is including both diet and any sort of supplements they were getting. And a lot of times, and we didn't report this here, but if you look at like something like vitamin K, like they're meeting like 3,000, it's 3,000% of their overall dietary requirements, because a lot of times it's being prescribed to our patients. There seems to be some differences in nutrient intake in terms of tube-fed and oral-fed patients, and definitely we saw this with sodium, and there was sort of like this sort of hint where this might be also evident in other nutrients as well. So we need to just basically get more data on this, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing next. So the overall kind of conclusions is, well, it may be a good idea to think about overall sugar and fiber intake, but do not, to any parents out there, do not make any huge changes in your kids' diets until you talk to a dietitian and your medical care provider. And we need to look at where are these differences that are occurring. And that's sort of, and hopefully this information will be important in coming up with some standardization for dietary recommendations. And then the idea, when I was doing my research, I didn't see dietary assessments in any sort of like populations that were similar to ours, like children with disabilities, children with rare diseases. So some of these sort of standardization protocols may be something that can be applied to other rare diseases as well. So I'm actually going to be presenting this to our families in the family part of the conference, but this is, and our dietitian is actually going to be here for that, and she was going to talk a little bit about some ways to potentially, lower sugar content. And for one of the things that we wanted to share is that Complete, which is a company that makes real food blends, they actually have started to really acknowledge that this home blending is becoming more of a thing. And instead of like sort of discouraging parents to home blend, they're providing resources on how to blend food in a way that's nutritionally sound, but also obviously recommending that they talk to a dietitian. And these are just some screenshots from the Complete website on how to go about doing home blending, either using their products or blending from scratch. So the other thing that I wanted to say is, because we have all these sort of nutrients that are sort of reaching significance, we want to continue collecting data, trying to get at least to the 20 that we originally set, because we had done this sort of, the statistician that I work with says that this is definitely not a power calculation, but provides similar information on how many patients that we actually need to look at statistical significance, and we really don't need that many more for a lot of these nutrients. So the second round of the study, we're going to be trying to recruit at least probably another 10 or so more. So Nancy Monthun is the dietitian that worked on the study, and she'll be here on Friday presenting to the families. But I wanted to thank the families that participated. It is not easy to ask parents who are already super busy to be like, hey, can you take another 4 hours out of your time to complete this? So much thanks to them. Dr. Adrian Carenhart did the statistics, and I had a lot of students, including a student who's here today, in putting this together. So that's it. Thanks.
So any questions for Dr. Bose?
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Thank you, Mousumi. I really share the experience that a lot of our parents actually have questions about nutrition, and we are usually really not able to answer any of those. But one of the things I was also wondering, I also had a lot of questions about which formula, for instance, is best tolerated, or which is best tolerated in which situation. Do you also expect that further studies will maybe give any guidance to that?
Formulas?
Yeah, for instance.
We didn't actually, we actually collected that data. We actually have a list of our tube-fed kids, what specific formulas they were using. And then we also looked at, in our sort of intake we did for each time point, we asked them what they were eating and, if they were using formulas or any sort of commercially prepared commercially food blends, what they were eating, and then also if they had any GI symptoms. But we didn't try to correlate the data as of yet, but that might be a good start in trying to figure out to see if there's, and we did get, we have I have here this slide just a sort of overview of some of the GI symptoms that some of the patients were experiencing, but I think that would be a good start to try to get a clear idea of what formulas are recommended. But really, that information is so, this is why conferences like these are so important, because that's where parents can get together and talk about what formulas are that are good for them. We can just, as researchers, we can sort of try to consolidate all this data, but I think that's really where the parents get the most advice, is from talking to other families.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and I can imagine that it's quite different for a PBD patient than for other tube-fed children. What is best tolerated, for instance.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we had a lot of families, and I remember in the Facebook group where they been on, their child had been on something like a shore for a very long time, and then suddenly they were just like, they just don't tolerate anymore. There's like reflux, there's vomiting, there's all these fun things going on, that's really when, and I think that's not just for GI symptoms. Like we see it for a lot of things, like where like seizure medications stop working after a certain point. So it's hard to like make any sort of like blanket recommendations and say this is how it's going to be for the rest of the time with your child. But it might, having resources like this may be useful.
Yeah, I think maybe indeed to try the correlations if you have the additional
yeah,
will be very valuable.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion.